An enormous study which might make you think twice about a low-carb diet. The study discovered the extent to which fibre can save you from a heart attack, stroke, diabetes and even premature death. The study leader was Professor Jim Mann, who's a world-leading human nutritionist based at the University of Otago in New Zealand. I spoke to him earlier.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, I thought we knew everything there is to know about fibre.
Well, we really did the study because we have resolved the situation with regard to sugar. And the second question was, how do we decide what are the good carbohydrates to include in the diet? So we undertook a very large systematic review to see which indicators of carbohydrate might be most useful at determining the best carbohydrates in terms of human health. So we looked at dietary fibre, whole grains, glycemic index and glycemic load, and decided on the basis of this huge review that dietary fibre was in fact the best indicator. And we've always known that dietary fibre is protective against a number of diseases. But what we came up with really surprised us in terms of the extent to which dietary fibre is protective against so many important diseases. This was really the surprise, the extent to which fibre was protective.
This was an enormous amount of data, 135 million person years from studies that have followed people through life and randomised trials where they've been given fibre. So when you bring that data together, and as you say, you landed on dietary fibre being the key factor rather than necessarily whole grains or the glycemic index, which is how rapidly your blood sugar goes up after you've consumed some carbohydrate, what did you actually find?
Dietary fibre, if one had reasonable intakes, and we came up with 25 to 29 as being the minimum ideal intake, that's grams per day, protected against the development of colorectal cancer. That was particularly striking, and in fact it seemed that the further you went beyond 30 grams, the further was the protection against colorectal cancer, protective against diabetes, protective against cardiovascular disease, and a reduction overall in total mortality.
And when you say total mortality, you mean age adjusted, in other words, we're all going to die, but the chances of prematurely dying.
Absolutely.
And what does 25 to 29 grams translate into in terms of your whole grain bread or broccoli?
That's an important question. One of the interesting things that comes out of this is, do we have to take fibre supplements or can we get it out of the ordinary food we eat? And the short answer, I think, is we don't know as much about fibre supplements as we do about fibre in the food we eat. So our data relate very much to fibre in food. And you certainly can get that from choosing whole grains if you are eating cereal-based foods, from having vegetables, fruit. If you do that and you do have whole grain cereals, you can relatively easily get to 25 grams a day. But what is interesting is that when we look at what the population is eating right now, most of us have less than 20 grams a day.
Really?
So it really does mean sticking to the guidelines. And it also means that if you are one of those people who is on a low-carb diet, you will have great difficulty in achieving that.
Carbohydrates is where we get this fibre from, is your argument.
Absolutely. So even if you're having good low carbs, you are not going to achieve those intakes. So I think it should make people want to think about whether there really is benefit to these low carb diets.
And when you looked at other markers like weight, cholesterol and other things like that, what were the findings?
the information for cholesterol and weight, blood pressure and so on come from the clinical trials. And fibre is certainly very effective at helping to reduce body weight in those people who are overweight. It's very effective in lowering cholesterol. There is evidence in people with diabetes that fibre is good at lowering blood sugar. The advantage of this kind of information is it helps to make sense of what we get from the prospective cohort studies. So if we say that there's a reduction in diabetes, there's a reduction in cardiovascular disease, it seems that that is mediated via the classical risk factors for those diseases.
And it comes to cause and effect, because those prospective studies that you were talking about, large numbers of people, even though there's large numbers, it doesn't prove cause and effect, it's just an association. Which brings me to a question about red meat. People have argued that one of the reasons, or perhaps even the substantial reason why fibre works, is that you eat less, particularly red meat, and therefore that it's a proxy for the rest of your diet rather than the fibre itself.
That is an incredibly important point that you make, and I think applies particularly, of course, to colorectal cancer.
Is it true,
where
though?
there's reasonable evidence that red meat and processed meat increases the risk of colorectal cancer. And you're, of course, absolutely right that people who have a high fibre diet, a high carbohydrate, high fibre diet, of course they tend to have less red meat. And to some extent, I think that may well be part of the explanation. But I think the one thing that provides additional evidence, there is an incredibly striking relationship, a dose-response relationship between the amount of fibre people eat and the risk reduction achieved. And that does tend to at least suggest that dietary fibre per se is protective. But we can't exclude the fact that these people also eat less red meat might be a factor.
And what about soluble fibre versus insoluble fibre?
We did not find much difference between the effects of soluble and insoluble fibre.
So how does this inform what one chooses to eat and how much in terms of whole grain, vegetables, or doesn't it matter? You just got to load yourself up with a lot.
Well, I think these data actually suggest that you load yourself up with some of each. You should have some fibre from whole grain cereals. You should have some fibre from fruit and vegetables and legumes, and pulses is really probably one's best bet.
Jim Mann, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
There goes the keto diet. Jim Mann is Professor of Medicine at the University of Otago in New Zealand. And you're listening to The Health Report here on RN, ABC News and CBC Radio across Canada. I'm Norman Swan.